Hi everyone. This week we're going to look at the Hohokam culture, and they're located along the Salt River in the Phoenix Basin. They're actually pretty interesting for a number of reasons. I mean, as we'll talk about, they lasted for a very long time, but they had extensive canals that they made use of. And I thought this was a pretty interesting quote found by Purdue and Berger in their article about the Hohokam irrigation systems, where they say water systems lie at the interface between nature and culture, and in that perspective are a rich but underemployed research object. And then you can read the rest. But it's a really interesting way to look at a culture, especially in our class, which of course is about sustainability. I've got a lot of information here on this slide. I probably won't go through every single bit, but I'd mentioned that they lasted for a very long time. So archaeologists think they got to start around 1500 BC, and then certainly went into about 450 AD. So they lasted a very long time. Now, of course, in the beginning, they were much smaller, and they started off with smaller irrigation projects. Again, we know from archaeology that they had pottery and that they practiced cremation. And the way that scholars divide up this society is by looking at sort of the earlier parts and then the middle, and then what they call like the sedentary period, where you don't get a lot of movement. That's what it really means here. And that's between 900 and 1150 AD. And then something called the classical period, up through 1450 AD. By about 750 AD, you see that they've built these irrigation or these canals, and it's possible that they're working together to keep the canals open because it is based on a river system, and it's much like what we talked about with the Nile, where the Nile comes in and it floods and it leaves a bunch of sediment. The sediment in the Salt River usually builds up along the floor, and it goes off to the side, of course, when it's flooding. But that all needs to be cleaned out and dredged. So it looks like these villages are starting to work with each other. What's really interesting about this, and it ties in with some things that are happening in Mesoamerica at this time, are we find oval ball courts, and these are massive structures where they played this ball game. So 75 by 100 feet. And 3-foot berm just means it's 3 feet up off the ground. And as I put here, this shows social organization. And as far as we know, they probably brought in people to play this game. And of course, this led to a lot of intermixing of people with trade, certainly helping their economy. And then you move into the sedentary and classical period, where these people were building mound structures. And these mound structures, if you know anything about the archaeology of North America, are fairly common, especially on the eastern side, like Ohio and Missouri and those particular areas. They build mounds in that area, and they build them here. And these are very large structures, so 180 feet by 150 feet, and then 9 feet high. There's a lot of debate in the scholarship about what these mounds are for. Maybe it's where the elite lived, the people who ran the government. And you find these all over. There's at least 50 that are within 5 kilometers of each other. A lot of times they had walled structures, and the scholarship is sort of divided about what these mean. Usually, especially in sort of Western cultures, the idea of having a wall means that you might have had some type of fighting. And so you build a wall to protect yourself. So, I mean, that's certainly possible with what's going on here. You do find their pottery all throughout a large part of Arizona. So they certainly had large trade links. They were a large group of people. And then populations, those are always hard to sort of guess, but maybe around 40,000 people. And of course, we know that the more they worked with their canal system, the less they depended on other things. So they went from being at the earliest period dependent on wild resources, plants and hunting animals, to later being dependent on their canal system. It's totally possible too that they stored water on a long-term basis because, of course, we know, like today, you get droughts. And what's really incredible is they built over 1,000 miles of these canals. So we talked a little bit about this earlier in the class, where you think about these structures, you have to think about other things too, like the type of organization that's going on to build these. This isn't something just a random group decided to do. Lots of people were working together. Okay, and then I've got a couple of maps here. Some are better than others, but what you can see, and let me see if I can get my pen to work. This is the Salt River, and these stars are where the sort of the major sites are for archaeologists today. And all of these gray lines, you can see all of these are the canal systems that they ended up building. And if you look off to the side, this is some things already mentioned. They built these canals, and then around 1450, these were abandoned. Here's just another map showing the same system up at the top here. Down towards the bottom of this map, you can see other groups of Hohokam that built canals. So it wasn't just in the Phoenix, what's called sometimes the Scottsdale system or the Phoenix system. They've lasted over 2,000 years, and I had mentioned this, that they became dependent on their canals for food. And of course, when you become dependent on a canal or irrigation like this, you really have to spend a lot of effort on keeping the water flowing. So you are probably in a bit of trouble if your organization breaks down. So if your government breaks down for political reasons or economic reasons, and you can't clean out the irrigation canals, those 1,000 miles or so, you will be in trouble in terms of producing food. And of course, in years of drought where you don't get a lot of rain, the flows will be reduced. This could cause breakdowns, probably because you can't feed the amount of people that you were feeding before. So it's sort of this negative cycle. It doesn't rain enough, you can't feed enough people, it affects the government and how you can actually clean the canals out, and then you get a government breakdown and so on. And then as I put here, maintenance is delayed or abandoned. This leads to less food, leading to more breakdown and so on. Okay, so you might want to think about what they're actually eating during this period. So once they're into the full irrigation, they're eating at least 2 crops each year of corn or maize. They're using agave for food and fiber. And then I list the typical other foods that you associate with Southern America, Central America, and then in the North America. So beans, squash, maize, fish. They grew cotton and they ate rodents. And they also foraged too. So they were still taking advantage of wild plants and hunting animals. You might want to think too, since we're a sustainability class, why develop these systems and why maintain them? And this doesn't necessarily pertain to the Hohokam, but just in general, when you've got a society, almost like the Nile, the Egyptians, why develop these and why maintain them? Well, of course, the biggest one is food production. You can grow a lot more food where you bring in water to where you didn't have it. And then there's energy production. There's whole industries built around river systems or canal systems. And of course, transport. You grow something upstream and then you can transport it downstream. Or if you've got sail technology, you can go back upstream. And then commerce. And then, as I put down here at the very bottom, think about human effort as well. How much it took to actually dig these canals in the first place, and then maintaining the canals secondly. And then when we come to the classical period, that should be 1150 to 1450 AD, not 115, so 1150. You find the civilization becoming much more highly organized in terms of its government. What's really interesting is that the ball courts become less used while people start moving closer to the large mounds that I described before. You also get some very large structures built called great houses, and I've got a picture on the next slide. I can show you that. Again, when you think about this, think about economy. So when people get to a point of being able to build large architecture, large buildings, they are highly organized. They have an economy to deal with that. They clearly have enough food to do that. And then, as I put here, possible canal association. So we know in the early period, there's probably some type of help between each of the villages, like organizing how they're going to clean out the canals or dig new canals and where they're going to go. That's certainly possible during the classical period as well. And then here's just an image of one of the great houses, which is under a cover. Okay, so you have, as I mentioned, archaeologists break down the Hohokam society into 3 or 4 major areas, depending on who you read. This is another version of that where you look at the different phases of when the canals were being built. And what you see along here are population levels and how they're corresponding to the canal. So in phase 1, which is this period, so the pre-classical period, you have the beginning of the canal systems, and you can see the population growing. Then you get to phase 2, where you get a large growth of irrigation, which of course means you can grow more food, and no big surprise, you see the population skyrocket. You get to phase 3, you get an abandonment of the canal system for a short period of time, and no big surprise, the population goes down, but it does level off. And then you get to phase 4. If you look down here, reconstruction of some of these, what is called hydraulic, it just means water systems. Population goes back up. And then at the end of 4, beginning of 5, you get large-scale abandonment of the canal system. And then populations go down, and you can see, if you look right across from here, the populations in 1450 to 1650 are actually lower than they were when they first started building the canals 800 years before. Okay, and I've mentioned this a few times where, whenever you have canal systems leading off a main river, you have to maintain these. And I mentioned this before, I'm just repeating it here because it's important to remember that maintenance shows a highly structured society, especially in terms of, cleaning these things out. Now, sometimes, and I've given you a few articles to read for this week, there is evidence that they weren't cleaned out. Now, why would you abandon a canal? So why would you abandon this type of system? Well, the main one is that, your government has fallen apart and you don't have the organization to have someone come out and say, hey, you need to dig, you need to clean this canal out. It's possible that river flows change, so that maybe once was a really good canal system of lots of flowing water might have changed just naturally because the river changed its banks or flowed somewhere else and it wasn't convenient enough to build a different canal. Okay, and when we're thinking about the Hohokam society, what's really interesting, especially for our class, is the decline. So I showed you that chart of population levels over time as the canals are being built or not being maintained. And, you have to think about why. So, did the canal systems help reduce the stress of the decline? Meaning, having a canal, did it make their society last longer? And especially if, you go into a period where it's drier or flooding as well can cause a lot of issues when you have a canal system. Or did the canal system actually increase the stress of the decline because they were reliant on this system? And I put here, in other words, did their success hurt them in the end? Meaning they had this great canal system feeding lots of people. You either had floods or you had droughts, and people were so reliant on the canal system. Did that success really hurt them in the end, especially when you see their populations going down, population levels declining further than they were at the very beginning when they started to dig the canals? And then finally, one thing we do need to think about is why did it decline? Why did they stop building their canals or taking care of them? This is a pretty big debate in scholarship right now. And what I've done is I've just listed a number of things that could be happening here. So there's no one reason why you got the Hohokam declining. So maybe wars, but as I put up here, there are walls, which we talked about, but little evidence of warfare. So maybe not that. We certainly do see floods, and dendrochronological, remember that's tree rings, show evidence for floods in the 1300s. And remember that the timeline for decline, they're declining around 1450. So in the 1300s, you have these large floods. You do get environmental degradation as shown by the archaeology. So if you remember, we talked about this with the Nile and other places, especially in Rome, where you've got water being waterlogged, or sorry, soil being waterlogged, meaning too much water in the soil. That leads to a higher level of salinity in the soil, which means, of course, that the plants can't grow. And of course, you also have sediment accumulation. So this is the issue we just talked about in terms of dredging. So as rivers are flowing down, they bring lots of sediment. If you don't clear out that sediment, then your canals are going to get clogged up. We do know that there are loss of native species from overhunting. And of course, you know, these are animals we're talking about, so it really is a loss of protein, so it really changes human health. We also see a loss of native plant species. So this is primarily when the population, human population, gets really large. People are out hunting, they're out foraging, and it's just too much for the native environment. And then there is evidence of high mortality rates, especially later when there starts to be a breakdown. And we also have this idea that there's migration coming in. So we talked about the ball courts. It's possible that, you know, sort of these are advertised and then people from all over come and play the ball courts and then, or play the ball game, and then they get together and do other things. So there's some evidence for migration happening, and maybe lots of people are coming in, and then this decline isn't necessarily a decline in terms of death rates, but maybe a migration out of the area for various reasons.